The Federal Reserve became a hot topic issue among youth during the 2008 presidential campaign of Ron Paul. Young people flocked to the elderly statesman as he rallied on about an organization nearly 100 years old. The Federal Reserve went from an organization about which most people knew little to a front topic issue. Many people protested in the streets, calling for the government to abolish the Federal Reserve. Some politicians have attempted to audit the Federal Reserve, hoping to see how the mechanisms of the group work. They have so far failed in their attempts to shed light on the institution. Many government officials and some economists say the Federal Reserve is needed to manage the economy. Without it, they predict devastating economic swings and runaway inflation. Some critics question that assessment, saying that the Federal Reserve creates more problems than it solves. Bill Still is a writer and a political activist. He has written extensively about the Federal Reserve, and he's recently produced a film that won Best Documentary in 2010. It's called The Secret of Oz. In his work, Bill Still compares the Federal Reserve to the magical land of Oz. Bill Still is our guest on the show today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Bill, why should people care about the Federal Reserve System?
Well, the main problem we have with the economic system in this country is that we have a central bank disguised as a public entity, disguised as operating in the public interest, when in fact that's just not true. The Fed, by its own admission, is a private corporation owned by banks and therefore must serve the banks alone. Everything else is a giant pretense.
Now, why did Ron Paul generate such interest among youth with talk of a 100-year-old institution?
Well, it's because he was on the money as far as the Fed being a major problem. I don't see the solution as auditing the Fed. What we need to do is completely take the money creation power out of the hands of the banks, which is what the Fed allows, and return it through some modality to we the people. So when I first did the Money Masters, this was back in 1996, I wanted to have a professor of economics take a look at it to be sure I hadn't made any mistakes. So I'd been a reporter all my life, so I knew how to get in touch with professors. So I called Milton Friedman, Stanford University, and got him on the line and asked him if I could send him a copy of the film. And he said, yeah, sure. He looked at it over the weekend, called me back up and said, boy, if you kill the Fed and don't end fractional reserve lending, you've done nothing. So the problem isn't really the Fed. The Fed is just there to fake us out.
So the problem is greater than Federal Reserve. The problem itself is a fractional reserve banking.
The problem is the banks, and they're through fractional reserve lending, they're able to create the nation's money supply, 97% out of debt.
For the viewers' benefit, could you give us a brief definition of fractional reserve banking?
Well, theoretically, the way it's supposed to work is if a bank has $1 million in deposits, then they're allowed to lend out $9 million through the fractional reserve lending system. However, we found out as a result of the 2008 congressional investigations after the crash that the banks weren't even following that rule. The big banks, J.P. Morgan and Citi, were loaned out 52 to 1. In other words, they had less than $2 in their reserve account for every $100 that they had lent out. Freddie and Fannie were lent out 80 to 1, and Goldman Sachs was lent out 333 to 1. So they're completely beyond the law at this point. They lend out whatever they want, essentially, and government is now powerless to do anything about it.
Now, your new film, Jekyll Island, goes into great detail about the birth of the Federal Reserve. Who's behind it? Who are the players behind the Federal Reserve System?
Well, they're the biggest bankers in the world throughout history. But really, I don't like to focus on trying to name one individual like the Rothschilds or the Warburgs or the Rockefellers or something like that, because you're never going to fix it that way. You have to go at what the real problem is. The owners of the Fed are all of the federally chartered banks in this country. They are the owners. The Fed is a private corporation, by their own admission now, a private private corporation. So a private corporation cannot possibly serve we the people. They are absolutely responsible to serve their stockholders, the banks, and that's what the problem is. We don't have.
You're calling it a private institution. How is it private? It's called the Federal Reserve.
That's all that's private about it. It's just the name completely faked everybody out, thinking that it was actually part of the government, when in fact it's not. It's a private corporation, and its stockholders are the major banks of all the major banks of this country.
Now, how does the Federal Reserve affect the lives of ordinary Americans?
Well, because they allow the banks to control the quantity of money. I have a saying, it's not what backs the money that's important. What's important is who controls the quantity. Right now, people think that the Fed is somehow effectively controlling the quantity for our benefit, but that's just not the case. The banks do exactly what they want. They completely control the quantity of money because they create 97% of our money, our U.S. dollars, both physical dollars and electronic money. The only money that the banks do not create out of nothing are the coins, the quarters, dimes, and nickels and pennies in your pocket.
Now, Congressman Ron Paul, the former congressman, used to refer to inflation as a tax. Is it true that inflation is a tax?
Inflation is a tax. Yes, it's a cruel tax, and certainly the Fed has facilitated the banks creating unprecedented levels of money. You know, we hear all about that our national debt is now $17 trillion, when in fact a recent study by a University of California, San Diego professor, and this just came out like 2 months ago, is that in fact the federal debt is now $75 trillion when you count in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid responsibilities. So it's much bigger than they're letting us know, and it's absolutely going to crush the U.S. economy. We can't just pay down. I want to make this is an important point. We can't just pay down the national debt. Any politician that says that does not understand where money comes from, or he's just outright lying. Because to pay down the debt, since all our money is debt, means you would extinguish that portion of the money supply that was that debt. Can you imagine having less money in the country right now? It would be an absolute disaster. The only way we can do this is to completely overhaul the system to make it a non-debt-based system.
We're up on a break, and I want to come back and I want to continue the conversation about that overhaul, the turnover between the Federal Reserve and the government, and the solution to this problem. But we do need to take this break. Stay tuned for more. We're talking with Bill Still right here on WHDT World News.